I think the other problem we have right now is what's real. And not just in Armenia, around the world.
Yeah.
There's so much information coming at us with so many different mediums. That's when we need to sit still for a second and really try to understand what information is real and what information isn't.
Definitely agree. Misinformation is probably one of the vices of today, and that has been really changing how we think about the world. And we need to make sure we have the right filters in place.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And the right media and just the right media literacy. I think that I wish our whole nation, Armenia and Diaspora, could sit through a media literacy class to really try to understand what out there is, what we can, take seriously and what we can't, and what to share, what not to share. I think we would do a big service to the country and the cause if we were a little bit more media literate.
Hello and welcome to the Soulful Entrepreneur podcast. I'm your host, Lucy Stepanyan. The purpose of this podcast is to get into the minds and the souls of entrepreneurs and to peek into the inner processes that result in multi-million-dollar enterprises. You can treat this podcast as mini therapy sessions with entrepreneurs to learn about their brilliant minds and souls. I would describe today's guest as an incredibly multifaceted human being, a true Armenian with a social mission at heart. A woman who is not afraid to be vulnerable, at the same time possesses incredible strength. Today's guest is the co-founder of Impact Hub Yerevan. She served as the Chief of Staff High Commissioner for Diaspora Affairs in Armenia. And now, among other things, she serves as the advisor to the Board of Directors of Health for Armenia and Global Partnerships Advisor to Impact Hub Network. Please welcome Sara Anjargolian. Welcome, Sara. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you, Lucina.
I want to open our conversation up with something you said in a TED Talk about 10 years ago, which is stillness delivers everything you need. And I think it really sets the tone for our conversation today because the name of our podcast is Soulful Entrepreneur. So I want to start from that place and set the tone for the rest of our discussion. Does this statement still hold true for you? And how do you find stillness in this crazy world with so many projects and responsibilities?
Yeah, wow. Thanks for unearthing TED Talk from over 10 years ago. But I think that it absolutely holds still, if not more, for me. Entrepreneurs in general are people who can't sit still. And more and more, I'm trying to teach myself that sitting still, but really what I'm saying is spending time sort of meditating on things can really give you sort of a little bit more of a light regarding where your path may take you. I think that oftentimes we, particularly those folks who are engaging in Armenia and places like Armenia, oftentimes see a mountain of things that need to get done, and that mountain just gets bigger and bigger. And if we don't teach ourselves to sit still and spend some time meditating on our larger purpose, then I think we lose our way. So that's a long-winded way of saying it's holds true more than ever, I would say.
And have you adopted any practices that help you to stay still within this past 10 years?
I would say I would say one of the biggest things that has transformed for me is to realize that I can only do what I can do, and I can only change what I can change, and that everything is not my responsibility. And particularly in Armenia, there are so many problems that one can delve into and fix, and I've had to teach myself that. Actually, I'm going to burn myself out if I try to tackle, too many things. So I would say that definitely I've learned that. And in some ways, I learned it sort of the hard way with all of the various, difficulties that are happening here. So, yeah, I would say for sure. But at the same time, I find I'm very consciously packing my calendar with things that give me positive energy, and those things are people who I consciously feel their sort of positive energy, or and moving my body. I think that it's really, really important. I mean, not so much like exercise, right? Sometimes exercise is considered working out or like killing yourself, but just moving my body. Particularly here in Yerevan, I walk everywhere. When I'm in LA, it's a lot of yoga. So just those two things, like almost like foundations, having positive people around me, and at the same time also just moving my body, whatever that looks like. So movement, just
Yeah.
moving, constantly moving, but then also being still at the
Yeah.
same time.
It's kind of a balance that you have to make sure that you have, right, between movement, going forward, doing, and being, which is stillness, sitting there, meditating, and yeah, taking things in. I
Yeah,
want
that's a
to,
really good way
yeah,
to put it.
yeah. I think I didn't say that. Eckhart Tolle said that. So just to make sure I don't take credit for that. But I wanted to delve deeper into the time before you moved to Armenia. You're obviously born and raised in the US. You went to Berkeley and you did your undergrad in majoring in poli-sci, and then you went to law school in the States. Can you talk a bit about your time and experiences before moving to Armenia? And also maybe what prompted you to do master's, to do a degree in law, and then also, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Just to clarify, I actually was not born in the U.S. I was born in London. But my parents both went to grad school. They left their respective countries. My father is Iranian Armenian, and my mother is Iraqi Armenian. They both left Iran and Iraq and met in London, and my sister and I were actually born there. And we moved to the States when I was 6 years old. And, like most families, immigrant families, my sister and I were both pushed, to focus on our studies, to become professionals. And ultimately, actually, my folks wanted me to be a physician, me to be a good Armenian doctor. My sister ended up being a doctor, but the rebel that I became went to law school. So frankly, why did I end up going to law school? I think it was a mix of family pressure to become a professional and kind of like be a serious professional, choose that road. But also, I held with me as a young person, and still the idealistic idea that I could change the world, and I thought with a law degree, that would be one step in the direction of setting myself up, both education wise and intellectually, to do something of value in the world. And I was super lucky that I ended up at Berkeley for law school, because it was as if Berkeley Law School threw a grand party and invited all these interesting people. Yes, people were really smart in my class, but more than smart, they were interesting, and they were wanting to, take on projects, take on the world, take on things that were larger than them. And that's really when I kind of caught the bug of not just education for education's sake, or education for the sake of becoming a professional, et cetera, but education for the sake of having a larger purpose. I think that's where I kind of caught the bug. And then ultimately, I would say, fast forward, that's really what led me to move to Armenia. But I think I'll stop there, and then we can kind of maybe loop back to that topic.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is basically the environment really affects the person very much so, in terms of where you end up really may affect the direction that your life takes. So you have to be very mindful about which rooms you're in, which people you interact in. This comes back to your point earlier on, which you're very mindful about choosing the people that you're interacting with, the rooms that you're in, where you want to influence people and where you want to basically learn from people. So I think that's a very important point. And so here came the question of purpose, I'm assuming your life purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And did you immediately understand what your life purpose was, or this was just a question that came, or like a seed that was planted in your mind that I need to think about a larger purpose beyond just academic achievement or career success?
I mean, I'm still trying to figure out what my purpose is, right? I think that if you're not constantly pushing the boundaries of purpose, then it just is not a very interesting life, at least for me. I think my first sort of understanding that perhaps part of my purpose might be found here in Armenia was when I had already graduated from law school and I was working as a young lawyer with the Department of Justice. So when I graduated from law school, it was like the height of like the tech boom, and I went to Berkeley, and so I was right there, close to Silicon Valley, and all of us from graduating from Berkeley or Stanford or the universities, law schools in the area were being offered these big salary law firm jobs that were related to the tech sector. And at the time, I was offered this job to move to Washington, D.C. and work for the Department of Justice. And and I chose that over the big firm job because I thought that perhaps if I pursued work within the government and the very prestigious idea of representing the United States in court, that perhaps there was a larger purpose there. And so I went to DC, and then I realized that actually the practice of law was much lonelier than I had anticipated, right? You spend a lot of time in front of your computer, writing briefs, creating arguments, et cetera. And so that was kind of the time when I said, there's got to be something more. And that's when I applied for a Fulbright scholarship and moved to Armenia. I was only meant to be in Armenia for about the length of the Fulbright, which is about 10 months, but I ended up staying for 2 years. And so that was the kind of transition where I realized, I can do a lot more with this law degree than the opportunities that were presented to me at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I think you've been flirting with Armenia since you were 19, right? So you came to Armenia a couple of times, you had this flirtatious relationship, but it didn't really get serious until, what was the point where you got really serious and you knew Armenia is the one, and I'm going to move to Armenia, I'm going to stay there, I'm going to live there? What was that point of transition?
I love the metaphor, and it's very true. It's really a relationship. And I would say that's the case for all people, not just Armenians, but non-Armenians, anybody who finds themselves drawn to living and working here or engaging. It's definitely a relationship that has its ebbs and flows, and, it has its ups and downs. And I would say doing the Fulbright here, I can't point to one moment, but I can point to a maturing of my relationship to the country and the understanding that this is a real country with real systems and institutions that work sometimes and don't work sometimes, as opposed to what we in the diaspora oftentimes were taught, particularly, before independence, that Armenia was this more of this mystical sort of area, this homeland, this place where we would, draw the mountains and the sun would come out from behind it. So it was this understanding that this is a country and it's a place that you can actually engage in real work and really good work. So I guess that's how I would put the sort of understanding of wanting to do work here. And also I'll say, it's not just about, it's actually a selfish decision. It's a decision of wanting to find purpose in a place. And also it's selfish because Armenia is actually a really great place to live. It's livable, Yes, we have major issues, particularly right now vis-a-vis security. However, if you just look at the day-to-day life here, and particularly in the last few years, how day-to-day life has changed, it's actually a very livable place. Oftentimes, I'll say a lot more livable than where I grew up, Los Angeles.
Yeah, I think it's important to underscore that because a lot of us live under the assumptions, especially if you were born and raised in Armenia, we live under the assumption that we have to break free from the country. And I have an example of that, which I always knew I have to break free and find a land where I'll be happy. I'll be able to tap into my fullest potential. And in some cases, that's not necessarily true, right? That doesn't always stand true. So what I want to discover a bit more and delve further is your exploring your Armenian identity and what it meant for you. I mean, you knew that this was the place where you wanted to live now, but I think a lot of us don't do the conscious work of understanding what does our being Armenian mean to us. How did you start this exploration phase of understanding your true identity, your national identity, or what being Armenian means to you?
I'm still doing that work. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out what Armenia means to me. And, like you said, it's a relationship. There have definitely been times where I wanted to break up, with Armenia because of the myriad of ways that I felt pain in the moments of engaging, the country and the work. I mean, there's lots of different ways in which I attempted to do projects here or create value here, and it didn't work. So those failures certainly caused pain, and I wanted to break up. So I would say I'm still trying to figure that out. I think the time when I did the Fulbright, it was in the early 2000s, and it was a very different Armenia. I mean, we would go to the supermarkets and there was like, two cheeses you would buy, right? Salty and not salty. And the Armenia of today, 20 plus years now later, it's a very different place, right? It's a very cosmopolitan, particularly Yerevan is a very cosmopolitan place, and some of the other cities. So I would say as the country is also changing, my relationship is also changing with the country.
Yeah. And I think I want to refer to something that you talked about before in one of your interviews is being a diasporan Armenian and obviously growing up in Armenia itself, like is two different things, right? What would you say unites people from diaspora, Armenians from diaspora and Armenians from Armenia? What are some similarities that we have and also differences that you've been able to observe over time?
It just really depends. I mean, obviously, there's some parts of the culture that we have in common, and then there's some parts of the culture that are quite different. Actually, I think that oftentimes, maybe not anymore, but definitely 20 years ago, when I did the Fulbright here, I wouldn't say that I was particularly prepared as a diaspora Armenian to move here and to understand the layers and layers of culture that came from the country being a former Soviet country. I mean, the former Sovietness, if I may put it that way, of Armenia was foreign to me because I was a diaspora kid from a Western Armenian family, Eastern Armenian, Barskaya family. And so there was nothing in my upbringing, I would say, that would prepare me for that. And so you live, you learn, you kind of make mistakes, et cetera. And I would say now, a lot of times when people will say, well, call me diaspora, I actually consider myself as a former diaspora Armenian. I say nachkin spyurkahayem because I really feel like this place, and I'm sitting right now in my home in Yerevan. This is really my identity now, whatever it was that I brought with myself from the diaspora and the day-to-day life here that's now kind of in my bones and in my blood. But in terms of what I think the diaspora and local Armenians have in common now at this point is the hope and the interest and the work that it's going to take to continue to build this country. That's what I think we all have in common, regardless of how we grew up.
Hmm. So you see hope in people. You see the motivation to rebuild and work hard to make sure that we mend what was broken. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, those are the conversations we're having here, right? I mean, everybody I speak to who is still working, whatever sector they're in, whether it's the tech sector, the banking sector, the nonprofit sector, the government sector, that's what everybody is talking about. Now, we all may be trying to mend in different ways, but those are the people I continue to surround myself with, and those are the people I'm interested in talking to. Obviously, as a people, we went through a major trauma with the war and the aftermath of the war, and we continue to go through this trauma because of the security situations in the country. But I'm most interested in surrounding myself with people who understand that we've gone through a trauma and are attempting as best they can as human beings, as professionals, as Armenians, to use that trauma towards building the country in the right direction. Otherwise, I don't see what else we can do, if I may put it that way, as entrepreneurs and as Armenians.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a super important point, because we need to stop and look at ourselves and see what is it that each of us can do. And it doesn't really have to be something big, something major to change the entire country or a system, but how can we do our job best we can so we can contribute to the development of whatever work that we are doing. And I think it's very important that we take a step back and really look at ourselves first before continuing the blame and, making other people responsible for the issues that we're having. And I'm not saying that that's not true, but what I'm saying is the only thing we can do is work ourselves and step back and think what we can do. So I think it's
and continue to be curious and modest, that we simply don't we're never going to understand the various forces and the nuances, right, of the situation. And so continue to be curious and modest in the way we think about all of these problems, I think is key. To be willing to sit down with people with different perspectives, and as long as we're both or all coming from a place of real information. I think the other problem we have right now is what's real, and not just in Armenia, around the world. Yeah. There's so much information coming at us with so many different mediums that a lot of times I think that, that's when we need to sit still for a second, right? And really try to understand what information is real and what information isn't. Yeah. I'll leave it at that.
I definitely agree. Misinformation is probably one of the vices of today, and that has been really changing how we think about the world, and we need to make sure we have the right filters in place.
Absolutely. And the right media, and just the right media literacy. I think that I wish our whole nation, Armenia and Diaspora, could sit through a media literacy class, to really try to understand what out there, is what we can, take seriously, and what, we can't, and, what to share, what not to share. I think we would do a big service to the country and the cause if we were a little bit more media literate.
Yeah. I think that's a potential project for you to think about in the future to work on.
I'll leave that to all my good friends in the media world who are already doing a very good job of that. But when people, write to me, and they say, "Oh, what's going on there? And is this true?" I love the is this true? Yeah. And I always feel like people want these like quick answers, so I'll just point out sources that I think are the right sources, but I'd like for people to do the hard work of understanding the nuance, of what's going on, obviously not just in Armenia, but geopolitically.
Yeah. Is this where you would say you have to channel your inner Zulu, meaning that leaving all the preconceived notions about the idea and coming fresh and thinking about whatever topic or the person you're talking to, leaving everything behind and really doing the work of logical analysis of the situation, or just having this honest conversations without any preconceived notions. Is that what you would say? That?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, trying to put those preconceived notions on the shelf, taking a minute to understand what it is that you're reading or hearing, and then thinking critically about that. I'm not saying that I'm successful at doing that myself, but, as I'm getting, sort of, I think with age, you do get a little bit more of that wisdom of not reacting and overreacting to everything. Take a minute, look at the facts, look at who's doing the talking, run it through a few filters, et cetera, then react, or don't react at all. I think not reacting is a decision that oftentimes we forget to make. So there's that too.
Yeah, so I think I could go on and on about this topic, but I want to talk a little bit about something different. In my introduction, I mentioned you're such a multifaceted human being, and you have so many interests, and you have so many skill sets. One of the hobbies, or maybe not even hobbies, so one of your professions is documentary photography. And I've seen some of your work with How We Live exhibit, and the documentary that I watched really moved me to tears, I must say. So what I've seen through your work, taking photos, particularly of Armenians and of the Armenians who are probably the most vulnerable and the poorest segments of Armenian population, I've seen incredible pain, suffering through those photos and videos. And at the same time, though, I've seen incredible resilience and strength. One of the women mentioned that I don't think I would continue living if it wasn't for my children. Something in those lines. And it really portrays Armenian mothers. It really speaks to who an Armenian mother is. I want you to share a little bit about what have you learned about Armenian people through your experiences as a photographer.
Sure. I'll just mention that I haven't worked as a documentary photographer in, I would say, 7-8 years. So it's been a while that I haven't worked on that. But indeed, I have a website, saraanjargolian.com, that shows the work I did when I was doing documentary photography. And it was a really, for me, the camera was really a tool to have access to lives that perhaps I wasn't living. And I was interested in people in Armenia who were living at the margins of society, whether that was people in the border villages, people who were, grappling with poverty, people who were, dealing with all kinds of other human rights issues in Armenia. For me, the photography part was really a curiosity, a time because the time you spend sitting at people's kitchen tables, having a cup of coffee, and the time you spend just having a conversation is so much more than the time you spend actually taking a picture. And it was really a massive education for me doing that work, because you spend time, you listen, you understand the nuances of the challenges. You can read all kinds of reports, right? Let's say on poverty issues, but until you sit down at someone's kitchen table and you actually understand how that affects their life, you really don't understand the nuances of that. And so that was really a very special and important time for me, because I came to understand the macro issues of Armenia on a micro level in terms of how it was affecting people's lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. And would you say that the work, that the experiences that you gained through documentary photography, did this serve as a seed for you to think about your future work? For instance, starting the Impact Hub Yerevan, or working for the public sector. Would you say that holds true?
Absolutely. Actually, I remember there was a moment at which I realized that, well, let me take a step back. The reason people do documentary photography a lot of the time is because they believe that by putting out images of real human life and oftentimes human suffering, that's going to push someone somewhere to make a change, right? Let's say a policy person, right? If you highlight and there have been photographs, right, in the world, generations of photographs which have done that, have shined a light on something and have brought such shock and awe that has led to change. So that's why a lot of people become documentary photographers. And that was the reason I picked up the camera. But there definitely was a point at which I realized that I'd like to go from being a storyteller, somebody who is giving the story to the world, to actually being on the side of proposing the solutions to the stories, to these issues. And I wouldn't say that was a conscious light bulb moment, but more of a process. And I realized And that's really when a few of these different projects and paths were born. Impact Hub, the co-founding of Impact Hub was really an understanding that Armenia's got all of these different challenges, and economic challenges, social challenges, political challenges, particularly when I moved here the second time in 2012. And there was all these really smart, well-meaning people trying to address those challenges, but they were doing it in silos. And so the arc of going from being a documentary photographer to starting the Impact Hub was really about trying to create a space and a culture of building solutions together. So if I can kind of turn back the clock and, remind everyone's listeners where we were in 2012, 13, 14, we were living in a country, that did not have free and fair elections. We were living in a country that had layers and layers of corruption. We were living in a country where you would still be stopped by the police, and bribes were asked of drivers. It was a very different Armenia. And so when we started the hub, we were hoping to address those issues by having smart people, entrepreneurs, people who were in business, people who were starting social enterprises, people who were starting nonprofit organizations, but have them stop being in silos and have them all in one space. So that's how the hub was born. Really, it was to deal with the issues that we were all seeing and feeling on our skin, living and working in Armenia, but bringing all of these smart people under one roof.
When I hear you say this, what comes to mind is a 10-year-old design thinking principle, which is first you empathize with the customers, in this case with people, right? We'll call them customers in design thinking. And then you actually, after empathizing with them, observing them and understanding their problems and just being in their shoes for a second, then you thought about the solution. Because so often entrepreneurs come to the table with a ready-made solution for let's say someone who they don't even know what they are going through and the experiences that they go through. So for you, it was such a natural process of observation, empathizing, and then thinking about brainstorming the solutions and then coming up with a Impact Hub. And I think later on, moving on to the public sector as well, I think this was a very natural course of your life and career, very beautifully structured. And I don't think you did that on purpose, but looking back,
Certainly
it
did
looks
not.
like it. It looks like a very strategic decisions that you've made throughout your career.
It's so interesting you say that, because I absolutely did not think of it that way or strategic. It was simply a lot of curiosity, and and that curiosity changing and shifting and ebbing and flowing, and just really good people, meeting a lot of good people here. We were 5 co-founders that started the Impact Hub. We did it together. We were all invested, interested, the people who joined the hub. So it was a combination of just a lot of curiosity and interest, and then just good people coming together, or the energy of those good people.
Mm-hmm. Talking a bit more about the Impact Hub, I guess initially when you just founded the Impact Hub, you interacted with young people, entrepreneurs who wanted to make a change, and this was they wanted to make a social change. What were some of the topics that initially entrepreneurs were bringing to the table? Do you remember any of them? And what were their interests back then? And then how has that changed over time? I'm not sure if you're involved with the nitty and gritty of Impact Hub Yerevan now, but you must know some of the topics that are mostly discussed and the solutions that are brought to the table.
Yeah, sure. Well, let me just say that we started Impact Hub with 5 co-founders, 1 staff member. I was the first executive director of the hub, and now there are 3 locations. The Impact Hub has 3 locations: Yerevan, Syunik, Impact Hub Syunik, that's based in Goris, and Impact Hub Gyumri. And it's got 30 plus employees and has dozens of programs. So Impact Hub is flying, without me. I'm still on the board of directors and super happy to continue to engage at that level. But the day-to-day and the programs and all of that are being run by an awesome team of people, and I'm super proud of that. And I would like to just take a moment to say that I think the best thing people can do when they start an organization, whether in Armenia or not, is to also make sure they have an exit plan. I don't think it's healthy for organizations to be associated with one personality or one person. And for me, not that I had an exit plan. We had a Velvet Revolution, and then I left the Impact Hub to join the government, and we can maybe talk about that later. But that was the point at which I left the hub, and then the hub flew by itself. So I forgot the original question. Maybe I wanted to say all of that to make sure that listeners knew how, that the hub has really grown since those. Oh, you were asking about the types of, we had all kinds of people. We had people doing startups in medical tourism. We had people doing startups in the environment, recycling. We had some of the first recycling startups at the Impact Hub. Now I'll see the recycling trucks, and I know the young people who came, 10 years ago to the hub and said, we're thinking of starting a recycling program in Armenia, So a lot of those ideas actually started at the hub. Some of the great hiking trails that we have all over Armenia started with nonprofit organizations at the hub. Media organizations started at the hub. EVN Report, that you may know, is the most well-known English language platform for media reporting, started at the hub. And I can just keep going on and on. And now the hub has gotten big to the point where it's also housing not just startups, but also medium-sized enterprises in all of those different areas. Yeah. I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of sectors also, but these are the ones that are coming to mind.
No, that's very helpful. And how has social entrepreneurship evolved since, I guess 2016? Because back then, and I was in Armenia back then, we didn't really have a lot of social entrepreneurship enterprises. I was running a business myself, and I kind of considered myself a social entrepreneur because I was doing social projects on the side as well. But the idea wasn't really intuitive to people. Has that evolved throughout time, and what was your contribution to that?
No, definitely not intuitive, right? Because particularly when we started Impact Hub, the idea, there was business, and business was for making money. And then there was the nonprofit organizations that were meant to do good, right? And the mixing of those two ideas, even in the case of Impact Hub itself, when we were trying to create the actual structure around the Impact Hub, we didn't even have the regulation and the legal mechanisms to create a social enterprise, right? In the same way that, for example, in the US, you can become a B Corp. So the idea has come a long way now. I think many people now understand the value of a social enterprise, and more people understand the value of having an initiative that has a built-in sustainability to it, right? So you are, changing the world, with whatever your product or your program is, but at the same time, by being an enterprise, whatever that may be, you're building in sustainability, and therefore you're not worried about going from one grant to the other grant to the other grant. Although that has a lot of value too, and certainly nonprofit organizations have their niche in doing that. But social enterprises have a very nice combination. And Impact Hub is that itself. It has an arm that does a lot of the nonprofit work, and it also has an arm that is actually the business arm. Mm-hmm. So it's come a long way. People know what it is now. Yeah. And people understand the value of running, having impact through a social enterprise as opposed to just a pure business or a pure nonprofit organization.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure statistically we see many more organizations who are social enterprises versus pure for-profits or pure nonprofits, which I think is great, because the world is going towards sustainability, social impact, and we all start to understand the importance of doing business for good idea. So I thank Absolutely. You for bringing that to Yerevan and encouraging that among young people. I think naturally, just following the timeline of your career, after the Velvet Revolution in 2019, I think you joined the public sector, which is the government, as a chief of staff, High Commissioner for Diaspora Affairs. Talk about that transition period a little bit. I guess you came into a place which inherited, and you inherited the staff and the institutional memory and the systems and the processes that were already in place. How easy / difficult was it for you to work and start and think about making a change in that space?
I was executive director of Impact Hub at that point by 2019 for already about 4 years. And what we were trying to do at Impact Hub, I mean, the values that we were, attempting to espouse through the Impact Hub's mission were similar to the values that came out or were planted, I would say, through the Velvet Revolution, right? Freedom of expression, freedom of thought, a free and independent country, free elections, free media, open competition for businesses, right? These were all things that we wanted to see in Armenia and that the Impact Hub stood for. And so it was this incredible moment for those of us, I mean, for every Armenian around the world, but particularly those people who were like living here at that time. The values inside of the walls of the Impact Hub, it was almost like overnight with the Velvet Revolution, the country started to reflect an interest in those values. And so post Velvet Revolution, many of the people who were sitting at the hub, or people who we worked with outside of the hub, who were part of the various activist movements that ultimately, started and culminated in the Velvet Revolution. All these people were entering into the government, right? So with these very young leaders entering in the government, young ministers, young, parliament members. And as I was watching, all of these different people taking these positions, I felt that I needed to do it too. I felt, it was a bit of an emotional decision, I would say. It was this feeling that this is it, right? This is our chance to build a new country, and the famous saying, if not now, then when? If not I, then who, right? And so I was quite idealistic in a lot of ways and motivated with this interest in helping build the country from the inside. Plus, on top of it, I had 10 years of government experience from my previous job. I was 2 years at the U.S. Department of Justice. I was 8 years at the city attorney's office. Before that, I was in DA's offices when I was in law school. So I had a lot of government experience. So long story short, I learned that the Prime Minister was going to create the Office of the High Commissioner for Diaspora Affairs. And I, proposed that I join, and that was that. And I ended up being appointed by the Prime Minister as the Chief of Staff for the Office of the High Commissioner. And I joined High Commissioner Sara Anjargolian in this, I would say, mission to build an office that was going to redefine Armenia Diaspora affairs, Armenia Diaspora relationship, and the way forward post Velvet Revolution. There was also this feeling I had that I've spent a lot of time on the front lines through my photography. I did several projects where I spent a lot of time in trenches with soldiers, interacting with soldiers. And I have this, how shall I put this? I have this understanding, or I have this feeling that to serve, in the capacity, the way the soldiers serve is really, the highest level of, service. And obviously I can't be a soldier. So I thought to myself, I'll give this 2 years. Just the soldiers do 2 years on the front lines. I will do 2 years in the government, despite the fact that my salary is going to be cut, to 1/4 to what it's going to be. I'm going to do these 2 years. And it was just this, emotional, idealistic, and the fact that I felt that I had the experience to do it decision. So that's a long-winded explanation of why. And that was 2019. And little did I know that I would end up serving in the hardest times, in our country's history, one might say. We were hit with COVID, and then the war and the post-war period, and then the elections. And it was quite difficult. But I want to just quickly also respond to your other question. I ended up going from a Impact Hub where things generally worked pretty well to inheriting, a system and a lack of infrastructure in the government where things did not work, nearly as well, and oftentimes didn't work at all. But what was the hardest part, I would say, is the culture. Mm-hmm. I think that what I found, and I think a lot of my colleagues who are still working in the government would agree to and sign their name under, is that we have a culture within the governing institutions that we inherited, in this country that does not allow for, doesn't set people up for success. It doesn't set up the employees or some of the leadership for success. And I can talk about that as well if it's, interesting.
Yeah. Can you explain further what do you mean when it doesn't set people up for success?
Look, I mean, just leadership styles, right? Like I can kind of compare and contrast it to the hub, right? At the hub, we had a very open, transparent, service-oriented leadership style, right? We were all in it together. There was no major hierarchy. Ideas were openly discussed. We were free to not even admit, but own it when we were wrong, when we made a mistake. Whereas in the government, it's very much what I would call an armored leadership style, right? You lead with a lot of armor. You don't lead from a place of vulnerability, which is something that I've learned a lot from, people who teach leadership, right? There's a way to lead where you're vulnerable, where you're strong because you are courageous enough to talk about your mistakes or, be open to all kinds of different ideas. And then there's the armored leadership style, right? Where you're inaccessible. You aren't, your leadership style is mired in kind of secrecy. And so just I'll give an example. When I first started working in the government, everybody's doors were closed. Nobody left their doors open, right? And I remember calendars, right? All of us, we do Google Calendar or other kinds of calendars. Calendars were still in written form, right? Because we inherited this idea that secrecy is where the power was, right? And so a couple of the things that I changed very quickly at the office was just made everything super transparent. We had an open Google Calendar. Employees, everybody pretty much knew, what meeting was happening where. My door was always open. People started to model that behavior. Their doors were open. I was accessible, and so I think that just shifting the culture in a lot of our governing institutions is the hardest part. And not just here, right? In a lot of different places around the world. I hope I was able to explain what I mean by that.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is you shifted from this authoritarian leadership style to more of inclusive and transparent and open and making sure that people can voice their concerns and come to you when they need to. Whereas before it probably was different, which was more, I am the higher up, you cannot come to me with your concerns or opinions. I have an opinion, you don't. And that I'm assuming that probably was the case, and that is the case in a lot of governmental institutions, not just in Armenia, but around the world as well, which is true. So that's what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And the fact that everybody has value, I absolutely was not going to be okay with sort of barking directives and having people, just, make those directives happen. I mean, it's just so uninteresting, and it's not who I am. And so the culture that we created at the Office of the High Commissioner at that time was that anyone who would come into my office or the High Commissioner's office with a problem, we asked for them to also come with a solution, as opposed to sort of waiting for, for us to propose solutions. And slowly that culture changed, I mean, just the culture of staff meetings, that didn't exist. Once a week, we had a staff meeting. Everybody was there, from the highest level in the office to the brand new newbies. Everybody was there. Everybody had a chance to, speak. Nobody was more important than someone else. And creating that culture. And then on top of it, having people be accountable for what they say, right? So we had a lot of people who would say, well, I'm going to do it like this, or this is how it should be. And just creating a system of accountability, right? By doing simple things like taking minutes and sending it to everybody. And next week, this, Mr. X, Y, and Z, or Ms., you said last week, did it work? Did it not work? What happened? Not in a blame or shame way, but in just an accountability way. And so this sounds so elementary and so simple, but these things just simply weren't in existence, in the culture of the office at the time when we inherited it.
Yeah, I guess you inherited it from the Soviet Union time style leadership, organizational leadership. So I think something that you mentioned, again, referring back to your experience as a documentary photographer, you mentioned when you traveled to South Africa that in some cases, and this was from your journal, I think, you said, I must be defiantly patient. I have no other choice. Would you say that was the case when you joined the office? You really had to be patient in terms of like the change, because I'm assuming everything you mentioned, it takes a lot of time to implement those changes and for people to actually accept them and to change with time. So would you say that's held true?
Huge patience. I mean, your well of patience, my well of patience was definitely had to be super, super deep. And also how I measured change had to change. How I measured change had to change, right? When you're an entrepreneur and you're, for example, at Impact Hub, right, we were measuring change with, much longer rulers. But, when I joined the government, change was super incremental, down to the way people may ask a question or the way they might engage, and so definitely I would say patience, our well of patience had to be super deep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but not just in here in Armenia. I think in general, we all assume things will shift and change much faster than they do. And I think human behavior, particularly things that are so deep-seated in cultural ways of doing things, certainly, don't change overnight.
Yeah. I guess another challenge that you might have encountered, the public sector is generally very male dominated in Armenia. It has seen some change in the last few years, and I see more women holding positions of power, but not to the degree that we want to see the change, right? So have you experienced, as you joined the office, have you experienced any bias against you based on your gender? And how did you overcome that challenge?
I don't know that it was there was such a direct sort of a direct bias related to being a woman, but the way decisions were made were often very male. And you sometimes had to fit into that in order to be at the decision-making table. There were, times where some of my colleagues, might not in an office environment, but, in a social environment might be, having a smoke and, having a very old boys network conversation, but decisions are being made while having a smoke, right? And if you're not there, or you're not kind of one of the people standing there having a smoke, then sometimes decisions are made and you're not part of it. So there are some like cultural things, I would say, where women aren't necessarily at those tables that sometimes would make me feel, like I wasn't going to be included. Now, I don't mean to say this particularly for our office, but the larger culture in which decisions are sometimes made.
Mm-hmm. And
Our
what?
office was actually quite, I would say, so sometimes we were blamed at our office for giving too, like more, what do you call it? Favoritism towards the women. We had a lot of women in our office. We brought in a lot of women. So I think we were kind of blamed for the opposite thing in our office.
And how did you overcome those like indirect circumstances where you felt that decisions were made? Did you try to make a change in that, and were you successful?
It just depended, I'm as my personality works better when it's collaborative, much less so when it's combative. And I found that there was a lot of combativeness, within the government, particularly because people were always kind of jockeying for position and power and, keeping information close so that they wouldn't, so that your project wouldn't succeed, and this kind of nonsense, frankly. So I would be patient. I would wait until dust settles. People have had, whatever it is their ego needs. And then I would kind of come back to the table and make things happen. And if I wasn't able to make things happen with certain people for whatever reason, I would find other people. I would find other partners. Or sometimes I would just stop, because I think that sometimes things will happen at the right time when the chips fall in a certain way, and you can't force certain things. So I was quite conscious of that as well.
Yeah. So you have to be more like water versus.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. And let me tell you that there was certainly moments where I thought, okay, I can't be like water. I have to be like a bulldozer.
Yeah.
But that just wasn't effective for me. For me, it was better to try to be a big tent, try to be collaborative, bring more people to the table versus, pushing people out. The bulldozer way never worked for me, whether it was in the government or, anywhere else.
Yeah. So you kind of were trying to create this impact hub within the government and making sure people collaborate under the same roof instead of in silos. Interesting. I want to
Yeah,
talk.
actually, I remember walking into the office at the Office of the High Commissioner on the first day, and I asked, like, can we knock these walls down, right? And it's in retrospect, it was such a funny question, because just to move a wall, you have to like do 5,000 different things, right? So I wanted to like knock down the walls and put up glass and, just change the feel of the place in order to encourage collaboration.
Yeah, and I think it works. Structural changes, even though we don't really understand it, subconsciously affect the way we think. If there's small rooms, cubicles, people tend to work alone and they just don't communicate, they don't collaborate. Whereas larger places with more transparency, they just set a different tone. So I think your hunch and your instinct was absolutely correct. It's just probably going to take another 20, 30 years until the change happens throughout the government. So I want to talk about the breaking point where the tragedy of the war happened and COVID-19, and you were actually pressured to resign at that point, but you didn't. Why was that?
Yeah, so to clarify, pressure to resign was just social media. The war ended. It was a catastrophe. People were shocked at how it ended. And particularly our compatriots in the diaspora were very, very angry. Many people were very angry. People were traumatized. People were hurt. People were didn't know what to do with their anger. And there was a time period right after the war where many of us who were in the government were being pushed to resign, right? Online sort of posts and things like that saying, well, the war is really, it's your fault. It's all of your fault that we lost this war. And so you should resign. And I have to tell you, I was really puzzled by that. I was puzzled, and I'm still puzzled by it. Although now I understand that some of it was pushed, some of it was the result of trauma and people not knowing what to do with their emotions and pouring it out on social media. And some of it was frankly just politically motivated, right? But what puzzled me is that that was a very, very critical time in our nation's history. And when a country loses a war in such a catastrophic way, there can be such destabilization, right? There can be a civil war, there can be a collapse of the government, there can be violence in the streets. And that's exactly the time where I believe that all of us who were, in these various government positions should have stayed and just tried to steer a very, very rocky ship as much as we could, kind of hold on until things settled down. And it was easy for anybody to resign. Resigning is easy. It was much, much harder to get up in the morning post the war and the catastrophe of the war and show up at that office and try to lead a group of people who were also traumatized, whose fathers, whose brothers, who were on the front lines, whose uncles and, nephews were killed. So at that time, I believed that the right thing to do was to continue to serve and to continue to stay as long as the ship was, in a very, very rocky place. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that was my thought process at the time.
No, yeah, you absolutely did. I guess it takes a lot of resilience and strength to actually stay in place, stay put, and continue working despite the negative comments and the pressure from social media. Did you hear any specific comments directed personally at you? And how did you take that? How did you cope with those stressors? Because I'm imagining holding such a responsibility on your shoulders and being attacked is pretty hard thing to do. How did you manage that, and how did you cope with it?
Yeah, there were actually. What's so interesting about the attacks is none of them were from people or organizations in Armenia. They were all from individuals and media platforms in the diaspora. And I understand that when you are very far away, you simply don't feel the nuance of the situation on your skin, and you are looking for a place to either place your own personal trauma of what happened or to place blame. And there were a few different platforms, as well as people's personal pages where I was attacked. How did I deal with it? I got up every morning and tried to keep working, and tried to keep surrounding myself with people who were working and who were attempting to steer the ship in very, very rocky waters. That's all I could do at that point. And and I was responsible for a team of people who were also traumatized, who were looking, at me and the High Commissioner saying, like, now what, so it was more important for me to show up and to show up for those people than it was to worry about, someone sitting in a far off place, being a laptop warrior. So that's how I dealt with it.
Yeah. But maybe 2 years after that, you actually decided to move on. And what was that decision? When was the point that you felt that it's time to move on? I've done everything I could have done here. And what was that point?
Yeah, I mean, when I took the job on, I told myself that I was going to do it for 2 years. This is way before COVID, way before the war. Professionally, I thought it was, I have so much that I'd like to do in Armenia and beyond. And setting up, well, let me just say, the service for the government, which was about over 2 years, was by far the most important time for me as an Armenian and as someone who really, truly now feels that I understand the issues of this country. So I would do it all over again, exactly that way, even with all of the difficulty, because it was truly an honor to serve. And I want to say this to anybody who would consider serving, whether it's in the government or, whether it's in the military. It's such an honor to do that for your country that I would do it again. But what happened was that the country settled down, and it was post-election, and we had what do you call it? Not a usual election, but sometimes I think in Armenian now, which makes me realize that I'm now a local. But
you can say it in Armenian.
Anyway, so we had an election.
Yeah.
The prime minister was reelected, and then it was kind of a new chapter.
Yeah.
And so I felt that this was the time for me to move on and allow new leadership to come into the office of the High Commissioner for Diaspora, and also because we had institutionalized several programs that didn't exist before. For example, there's this program that is my baby. It's called the IGORTS program, which still is being implemented by the government. And all of these programs had been institutionalized. They were in the budget, of the Republic of Armenia. And the country was relatively more stable, and the office was stable. And so I thought, okay, now is the time that I can move on and I can do other things, use this knowledge that I had to give back to Armenia and beyond in a different way. So I left on, quite good terms. I have very good relationships with almost everybody I worked with in the government, and the people at the Office of the High Commissioner are still very dear to me, and we see each other on a, monthly basis. Yeah.
Yeah. And
there.
I think, thank you. I think so. When you just joined the office, one of your agendas was to map out the resources that we have in diaspora, which is the human resource we're talking about, which I think was such a brilliant idea because Ricardo Hosman, who is an economist, and he's the founder and director of Harvard Growth Lab, he talks about economic development and accumulation of know-how and how important the capabilities are for the economic development of the country. So he talks about capabilities as letters, and the more letters a country has, the more sophisticated products it can produce, right? So I think it's such an interesting, a great idea to map out all the capabilities that we have, not just in Armenia, but in diaspora, that could bring the know-how to Armenia and create products or create this complementary skill sets and capabilities to lead to economic development. Have you been able to actually accomplish that, or is it still in process?
Well, I love that you gave that example because it goes exactly to the crux of what I believed and still believe is the shift that needs to happen between Armenia-diaspora relations. For many, many years, diaspora was meant to financially support the Republic of Armenia. When I started at the High Commissioner's office, we wanted to absolutely turn that on its head, to say, diaspora, thank you for your years and years of financial support, right? Infrastructure support, investment support, nonprofit support. But now your money is important, but your know-how, your brain is so much more important, right? The Republic of Armenia could never afford, right, to pay for the know-how that we have, the time that we have in the diaspora. Yeah. But we never created the culture and the ask and the systems through which our diaspora could bring its brain power and its know-how in service of the country, and particularly in the governing institutions. We don't even know who really our brain power in the diaspora was. So in the office, there were three things that were super important to me. And one of them was the mapping of diaspora professional potential, right? Understanding who we have in these various communities who could bring their know-how in service of the country. And the IGORTS program was also born from that. Mm-hmm. Now, granted, it was a program, because we institutionalized it in the Republic of Armenia budget, we didn't have a massive amount of funding behind it, but it wasn't the funding that was important. It was the invitation that was important. It was the first time in the history of the Republic of Armenia where the government is saying, diaspora, I want you to physically come and I'm going to place you in our governing institutions, right? We were inviting people to come become fellows inside of the government, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Social Welfare, Education Inspectorate. And we were saying, we want your know-how, and we're inviting you to come and give us your know-how. That was huge. Now, the extent to which that know-how was put to use, I mean, we can debate, right? Was it put to use? Was it not put to use? Were these people used in the right way, et cetera? That's a different sort of question, and we can analyze the impact. But the invitation was very new. And I'm very proud that that program and that invitation continues to be renewed. Now it's in the 4th year of its existence.
Yeah, I think that's a great program. And there's also Neruj, and I'm not sure if you were responsible for that program or not, but that also I think is in similar lines. This is more for entrepreneurs, basically, to start their businesses and operate in Armenia, although they can be anywhere in the world, right? So I think both of these programs really make a difference, but I think more funding would make sense to bring
totally.
to the table.
Yeah, Neruj was not my program, but I was involved in it. It was a great program. It was started right after the Velvet Revolution, and it was very similar. It was saying, hey, diaspora, come bring your startup, base it in Armenia, and we're going to give you funding to do it. And it was a great program. I'm not sure if it's continuing. I hope it is. I think they ran it for a couple of years. Yeah.
I hope it is, because I'm planning on taking advantage of it too.
That's right. We're waiting for you, Lucina, to come set up your startup here.
That's my plan. That's a goal. I guess I want to transition a bit about to your current body of work and what the project that you're working on. But before that, I want to touch base on one thing in this transition period in your life where you're done with public service, you've moved on. It's time to recenter, refocus, and kind of recuperate, because it's been tough considering the circumstances of the country. How did you center yourself, ground yourself, mend yourself, mend the broken pieces, and put yourself together to continue working? What was that process like?
Well, I took a break. I mean, I after I left the government position, I consciously took a break. I went to a retreat center up in Big Sur, which is one of my favorite retreat centers. If people don't know about it, it's called Esalen. And I spent alone time there for about a week, spent time writing about what I learned, spent time kind of reflecting on what my time in Armenia meant, and the last 2 years, in the government meant. And I just spent some alone time, really reflecting, thinking, talking to people who had the capacity to hear me and to reflect without, layers and layers of, other stuff, other motivations. Who you surround yourself, who you walk that road with is so important, and I'm so thankful that there were those people. So that's what I did, and came out of that process realizing that actually I want to continue doing this work in Armenia and beyond. So now I'm working as a consultant on several different projects. 2 are Armenia related and 2 are not Armenia related. So I'm starting to reopen myself up to global projects, which I love. And, today with everything kind of being virtual and online, I'm able to do global projects, but do them from Armenia and then continue to, work here and work in LA. So yeah, that's where I am too. Would you like me to tell you about a few of them?
Maybe you can tell me, what are you most excited about? Which of the projects are you most excited about that's on your radar right now?
Well, that's like picking one child and say I love that one the most, but but I'll mention
more on which one do you work most your time on at this point in your life?
Okay. Look, they're all dear to me, but one thing that maybe I'll mention this one because it's an entrepreneurial one and might be most interesting for your audience. But I know that you recently interviewed Larissa Hovhannisyan of Teach for Armenia. So I'll mention that Larissa and I, as well as a few other people, Dr. Shant Shahardimian and a few other very talented healthcare people, are about to launch Health for Armenia post leaving the government. I spent also some time being advisor to the Minister of Health. And through that process and through these collection of really wonderful entrepreneurs, we decided to start the healthcare version of Teach for Armenia. So we're about to launch that. And it's totally a startup, very entrepreneurial, bare bones, and we are going to learn by launching with 10 physician leaders in the rural areas of Armenia. So stay tuned. The website is about to launch next week. So we're going to do that. And I'll stop there. There's several other projects I'm doing here as well as globally, but I'll leave those for a different podcast.
I hope I can have you. I can steal you for another episode in the future as well. I want to wrap this up by a last question, which I ask all of my guests. Actually, last two questions, if I can squeeze one in. One is what advice would you give to your younger self, to the woman who just freshly graduated from university and is about to embark on her career journey? What is the advice that you would give her?
Have more fun, just have more fun. Don't be so hard on yourself. I think those of us who grew up in these very strict immigrant households where you had to be the best and you had to show the best face and you had to please everybody, I just would tell my younger self that, don't worry about pleasing people. Don't worry about, being the best of this and the best of that. Have more fun, chill out a little bit. That's what I would say to my younger self. I don't think my younger self would listen, but that's probably the advice I would give.
Yeah. We learn from experience, not necessarily from words that we listen. Otherwise, we would all be super, super smart and do really well. And my last question is, and this question is a bit esoteric, just just to prepare you for that. If you were stripped away from all of your accomplishments and achievements and everything that you were able to achieve thus far, still, you've done all the work, you have gone through all the processes, but you're stripped away from the results and the achievements. What would you be left with?
Capacity for kindness, I guess, is what I would be left with. I would want to, no matter what success, failure, etc., I really never want to lose the capacity for kindness, the capacity to connect even more, maybe. The capacity just to connect with people, to meet people eye to eye where they are, to listen, to be patient, and continue to be curious. Curiosity and connection, I think, are the two things that keep me going and keep me interested in different things. So, people, and then the curiosity to learn, make mistakes. I think that's where I would like to hold on to, regardless of everything else.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Sara. I appreciate all the conversation, your honesty, the time that you've devoted to speaking to me, and also your trust that you've put in me as an interviewer to actually have this conversation with you. And I'm sure this will be super useful to people. And I would love to unpack more because, like I said, there's so many layers to you that I think I've just scratched the surface of your life and just unpacked a little bit of you. But I would want to learn more about you, Sara, and not you as the founder of Impact Hub Yerevan or anything else, but you as a person, as a human being. And this was an honor to interview you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucina, for this podcast series. Thank you for, your time and your interest, and, what you're doing is really a great service. And I hope what you're doing inspires more people to be curious and to connect.
And with that, thank you.